Hi, my name is Christian, and let's draw something interesting. This is the mountain that I drew in the previous section, and what I want to do now is show you that this mountain living by itself on this little inks layer has no solidity. It is just the ink. It is just a framework. And what I want to do now is give it some fill in and some shadow and some highlight. So to that end, I've got a undercolor layer. It's just a standard layer, transparent, below the inks. I'm going to grab myself a nice sort of neutral gray. I'm going to go to my hard brush, and I'm going to fill in this hard gray solid color along these ridge lines so that I have a nice stop to the color right where the ridge line is. The reason I'm using this gray is because most mountains have sort of a slate gray, stony granite kind of appearance to them. And even though many mountains will have foliage, you can always add that foliage in later. What I basically want to do is have a differentiation between the kind of base coat color that a mountain would have and the sort of dirt and vegetation that the surrounding terrain would have. So I'm just throwing this solid gray in here. Looks bad at the moment, but I'm going to switch to this tinting brush. This tinting brush responds to pressure, so I can gently fade the gray so that the mountain sort of fades from its stony height into the more dirt and vegetation kind of colors that will be around the mountain. So everything up high will be more of a grayish color, more of a desaturated color, and then as it gets lower, using this tinting brush, I'm just sort of fading that gray out into the kind of color that I have behind everything else. So I'm just using the touch of the Apple Pencil here to give myself a nice sort of fade. And if I don't wind up actually fading stuff quite right, if it's a little patchy, I can always use the smudge brush to smudge that color out. But that looks pretty good. The color's kind of fading in a nice way. Now I'm going to add some highlights and shadows. For shadow, I'm going to go to pure black, and I'm going to go to a shadow layer. In the shadow layer, I have a blending mode set to multiply. You don't have to know a ton about blending modes, but know that if you're putting shadows on something, multiply is probably the main blending mode you're ever going to need to use. I'm going to use a small shading brush here, and this brush is actually, I'm going to use the larger shading brush first. So I'm going to lay down some large shadows. This brush, you can see here, I can make the brush size really big, but I'm going to just stick with something kind of conservative here. The opacity, I've got it at about 20%, and I'm working on that shadow layer, the multiply shadow layer. And so I'm just going to assume, again, like before, that my light source is coming from this direction. And so the shadow is going to be cast over here. The mountain is going to be casting a shadow on itself, and it's going to be casting a shadow on the land around the mountain. It doesn't have to go very far, and basic principle here is that shadows are going to be more intense near the ridge lines that are casting the shadow, less intense near the bottom where the mountain is fading out. We're going to have a little bit of shadow on this side as well. This is the main shadow that the mountain's casting on itself, but over here, this ridge line here might be casting a little bit of shadow into this valley. So coming off of that ridge line, I've got a little bit of shadow. And if I get too intense, I can smudge it out. Now that looks a little loose. It looks a little not quite as precise as I like. So I'm going to go to my smaller shader now and pull the size down a little bit. This shader works the same as the big one I was just using, but gives me a smaller, more controllable tip. And so what I'm going to do is going to make those shadows really intense up near the top of the mountain and near the edges of the ridge lines, and then the shadows are going to fade out as they near the bottom and fade out as they kind of fall off into this valley here. And might not put as many shadows on this side, because I might think that this part of the valley here might be getting a little bit of light, a little bit more light than this part of the valley. This part of the valley is casting the shadow, is probably going to be darker. So letting the shadow be more intense over there, put some intense shadows on these side ridges here going this way, but still allow them to fade out. Everything, all the details on the mountain, all the colors, all the highlights, all the shadows, they're all going to fade out towards the bottom of the mountain because the mountain is merging into the ground. Some of these little ridge lines here might have little shadows behind them, little hollows behind these little ridge lines. This helps to sell the dimensionality of the mountain, these little shadows here and there. So that's looking pretty good shadow-wise, I think. Now we're going to switch to highlights. I'm going to go to a pure white, and I'm going to go to the highlight layer. It's over the shadow layer, and I have it set in a lighten mode called Add. Screen is also fine. Add is also called Linear Dodge in Photoshop. I just happen to like the way Add looks a little bit more than Screen. So keeping with my small shader, now I'm going to find the areas that are kind of facing the light, facing the sun, and I'm going to give them some highlight, and I'm going to make it more intense towards the top and less intense as it goes down the bottom. Just like the shadows, more intense at the top, less intense at the bottom. So the top of the mountain will be nice and highlighted, and these ridge lines here will have a nice sharp highlight on them, but as they come down, they're going to fade out. And I'm not going to have the highlight generally interfering with the shadow. I'm going to avoid the areas that I've already shadowed and kind of put the highlight in areas that don't have shadow, that are going to be facing more light. That got a little intense, so just back off and fill it in like this. Okay, so I've got some highlight, and if I want to, I could maybe put a little bit of highlight up here, showing a little bit of light sneaking across the top of the mountain depending on the angle of the sun, hitting this promontory over on that side. But I don't want to continue that much because most of this is going to be in the shadow of the mountain itself. So now I've got my mountain with some shadows and some highlights, and it looks like it's kind of blending into the ground pretty well. It's got a presence to it. I might, at this point, give it a little bit of more color, maybe a little bit of foliage color. I've got sort of a scattery brush here that I could use, and I can go in and maybe put some foliage on the ground, have the foliage kind of sneaking up into these valleys a little bit. And the nice thing about this is that since I've already laid down my highlights and my shadows, as I go into the shadow, the foliage is going to be in shadow. As I go into the highlight, the foliage is going to be highlighted because those layers are on top and they're shining down onto the foliage that I'm putting down here. So you can have your mountain starting to look like it actually belongs, like it actually lives on this plane, like it has some substance to it, by filling in details like that. It gives it some real dimensionality. Sometimes you might overdo it, you might have to make some things a little bit more transparent, but that is the basic technique. And kind of cool thing is that if you don't like the hard ink drawn style, I tend to like it, but what I always like to do is after I've filled in the details, I can go and I can turn the inks off, and I can see it's like, oh, there's a mountain there. It's a mountain composed of shadows and highlights with a little bit of stuff on it. At this point, I could, if I wanted to have more of a painterly style, I could go in and merge all this together and sort of paint it out, and I've already produced the structure and the look of the mountain just by drawing the inks first and then filling them in with shadows, highlights, and some extra undercolor on top of it. So until next time, this is Christian attempting to draw something interesting.